Hello, everyone. So my name is Zhen. I'm a PhD candidate in finance from the University of Maryland. First, I want to thank the organizer for including my paper to this amazing conference. I really couldn't ask for a better audience than this. So the title of the paper is Bank Divestment and Green Innovation. The broad motivation of this paper is that over the past decades, we have seen increasing pressures for the banks to divest from firms with high carbon emissions. As a consequence, many of these banks have started to reduce their lendings to these high carbon firms, including important players that were significant lenders to fossil fuel companies and other high carbon companies, such as BNP Paribas, HSC, BC, and ING. On the graph, from the graph on the left, on your left, here you can see that the share of syndicated loans received by US public firms in the 10 industries with the highest carbon emissions have reduced from about 23% in early 2010s to about 16% in 2018. Right, so the argument supporting the bank divestment is fairly straightforward. By limiting the assets to capital for this kind of firms, we might be able to force them to scale down their productions, thereby lowering the carbon emissions coming from their productions. Now, even if this works, which of course we know from Marston's paper that it doesn't really, we still might not have all the necessary ingredients to achieve net zero targets. So here, based on a 2022 report by the International Energy Agency, half of the the CO2 reduction that we need in order to achieve net zero by the year of 2050 would depend on technologies that are not yet commercially viable. I know after the previous presentation by Cédric, maybe many of you now feel not as optimistic about the promises of green innovation, but I think one thing we could agree is that we still need more green innovation and perhaps more importantly, better green innovations. Now, we also know from the literature, particularly the paper by Cohen et al., that firms in high carbon industries, particularly the energy sectors, could be important key innovators in the space of green technologies. I know that I'm going to come back to the definition a bit later. So this brings us to the question, what's the effects of bank divestment on green innovation, right? Is the effect aligned with the very purpose of the green innovation, the bank divestment? And this is exactly what I hope to shed light on in this paper. The first question that I want to answer is, how does bank divestment affect green patent filings? When it comes to firms with high carbon emissions, the effect could be either positive or negative. So on one hand, now with the higher cost of capital because of bank divestment, it becomes more costly for these polluting firms to pursue green innovation. On the other hand, now there's also heightened incentives for them to make their products or the firms greener, because not only the customers, but now also the banks value this. So the ultimate effects really depends on which one of these opposing forces is stronger. The second thing that I'm going to look at are the characteristics of the green patents. So the things I'm going to look at a few characteristics here, including private values, such as the stock market-based value coming from Kogan et al. QJE paper, citation, and also a tax-based relevance to mitigating climate change impact measure. Okay, now the baseline definition of green patents that I'm going to use in the paper comes from OECD. So these are patents that are related to climate change, adaptation, environmental management, and other environmental technologies. I'm also going to show you some results using the alternative definition of green patents that Cédric just introduced. To empirically estimate the effect of bank divestment on green innovation, I'm going to utilize the bank's commitment to science-based target initiative as divestment shocks. So since 2015, a number of banks across the globe committed to carbon neutrality by joining this initiative. As part of the initiative, they're required to set targets on their lending activities and recommended to phase out financial support to fossil fuel and firms in other high carbon industries. And as Marcin showed in his paper with Jose, this committee banks subsequently allocate less credit to firms with high carbon emissions using a sample of global banks with syndicated loans. I verified that this pattern also holds for the US public companies, which is the focus of my study. So in terms of the data, so first of all, I'm going to be focusing on the period from 2011 to 2020. I will be focused on the US public firms that file at least one patent during the same period, which I call innovative. The bank commitment status comes straight from the SBTi annual report. Bank lending comes from DealScan. Firm characteristics comes from CompuStat. The patents data comes from USPTO. I'm going to supplement this patent data with the stock market-based value from Kogan and co-authors' paper. And finally, for a small subset of the firms that I have here, I'm going to have their carbon emission information from Bloomberg. So for the baseline analysis, I'm going to look at the effect of SBTi commitments on the sample of US public firms in the 10 industries with the highest carbon emissions. For simplicity, I'm going to call these brown firms. And of course, a natural concern is that my results could be driven by my choice of my definition of the green firms here. So I'm also going to look at the whole sample of US public innovative firms for which I have carbon emission information, sort of as a robustness check. The specification that I use for the baseline analysis is going to be this Poisson difference in differences model. I use the Poisson model because the outcome of interest here is the count variable, being the number of patents filed by these firms. And then the key variable of interest on the right-hand side is the variable committed, which is a binary variable that equals to 1 if firm I has at least one relationship banks that commits to with SBTi by the year T. So here, the treatment groups are the brown firms with committed lenders, and the control firms are the brown firms without committed lenders. The identification assumption is the standard DD assumption here. So that being the trend of the dependent variable by firms with SBTi lender would have been the same as those by the firms without SBTi lenders, absent the shock. And I think some of you already mentioned, like this is a staggered diff and diff specification, so I also make some adjustment following the suggestions in the Baker's and co-authors GFE paper. Okay, now, here's the baseline results. So in the first two columns, we see that bank divestment has a significantly negative effect on the green patents filed by the brown firms. Because it's a Poisson model, the coefficient here could be roughly interpreted as the percentage change. So after the commitments, we see roughly 39% lower green patent filings by these firms, which roughly translate to 0.6 fewer green patents. And then from columns 3 and 4, we don't see any effects on the non-green patents filed by the brown firms. There could be a number of explanations for why these brown firms cut their green patents before they get to the non-green patents. So one explanation could be that the green patents, they're more capital intensive, as Georgia suggests in her paper. And another potential reason is that the green innovations, these patents that depends a lot more on other patents that are further away from the firm's core technologies, which makes them associated with higher uncertainty. And now to lend you some support for the validity of the empirical design, here I show you parallel pre-trends in patent filings by the Brown firms. So on the left, I plot the difference in green patents by the treated and control groups. And then on the right, that's for the non-green patents. In both cases, we don't see significant differences between the two groups before the shock. Okay, next I look at all the firms for which I have carbon emission information. So CO2, that's the level of carbon measured as the log of scope 1 carbon emissions. And then carbon intensity is the level of carbon emissions scaled by the firm's total assets. And in addition, in columns 3 and 5, the dependent variable here is the number of green patents defined as in Patrick's paper with Merson and Moritz. So basically across this, you see that for the firms with high carbon emissions, we see these negative effects. In column 6, I look at only the firms within the brown industries, and we see that even within these brown firms, the negative effect is stronger for those firms with even higher carbon emissions. And this makes sense because these are the firms that experience even stronger negative credit shocks from the bank divestment. One important hypothesis that I test in the paper is that the effect should be a lot weaker for firms with better access to alternative financing. So here, high cash flow is defined as a binary variable that equals to 1 if a firm is in the top 30% in terms of the average cash flow. And high external equity financing is defined in a similar way. So here we do see that the negative effect that I showed you earlier is really driven by firms without high cash flow or high external equity financing. So firms that do have great access to alternative financing, we see the effect is a lot weaker. For the interest of time, let me summarize a few other findings regarding the green patent filings by these brown firms. So first, what I find is that the negative effect of bank divestment on green patent filings is really coming from the intensive instead of extensive margins. What I mean by that is that it's more about firms that file quite a few green patents in the past, now filing less, instead of firms filing perhaps several green patents in the past and suddenly stop filing altogether. I also find that the inventors of green patents in this high carbon industry are in fact more likely to stay with their employers after the commitments. But conditional on staying, the patents filed by these green inventors are more likely to be non-green instead of green. Now, okay, so far I have shown you the effect on the brown firms, then what happens to other firms with lower carbon emissions that have lending relationship with these committed banks. Because after these banks lower their lendings to the brown firms, now they have more credit that they could allocate to other firms in their portfolio. Right, so this could also affect their innovation activities. So here I look at the non-brown firms. The treated groups are the non-brown firms with committed lenders, and the control firms are the non-brown firms without committed lenders. So here we see a positive effect on the green patent filings, but we don't see any effect on the non-green patent filings, which is sort of consistent with what Georgia finds in her paper. Okay, so basically, right, so far we have seen that after the bank divestment or commitment, the patent filed by the brown firms goes down, but it kind of got offset by the increase in green patent filed by the non-brown firms. So now the important question is there any effect on the characteristics of these green patents? So in the data, we see that the green patents filed by the brown firms, on average, they have higher citation, higher stock market values. So it might be optimal. So the bank divestment might be optimal if what we see is either no decline in the value of green patents filed by the brown firms following the shock, or if we see an increase in value of those green patents filed by the non-brown firms after the shock. Unfortunately, that's not what I find in the paper. So what I find is that the bank divestment have a negative effect on the private values, measures either the number of claims or the KPSS stock market value of green patents filed by the brown firms. And in addition, when I look at the social values, which includes generality, originality, and forward citations of these patents, I also find a negative effect on generality and originality of the green patents filed by the brown firms. And I don't find any effects for the green patents filed by the non-brown firms. I also developed a new tax-based measure to capture the relevance of each green patent's relevance to mitigating climate change impacts. The way that I do it is that I go to the title and the summary of these patents, and I then identify a set of patents that we feel very confident that they're are related to this climate change impacts by a bag of keywords. Then I calculate the cosine similarity of other green patents to this set of patents to construct this continuous measure. And basically what I find is that the relevance of the green patents filed by the brown firms to mitigating climate change impacts also declines following the shock. And again, I don't see any effects for those green patents filed by the non-brown firms. Okay, then let me just quickly conclude. So basically, my paper shows that bank divestment leads to a reshuffling of who produces green patents. And the effect of bank divestment on the value of green patents produced by brown firms seems to be negative. And on the other hand, the value of green patents filed by the non-brown firms has not seemed to catch up. With these results, I hope to contribute to the literature of climate finance and bank finance and innovation. Here I list some of the most relevant papers to my paper. And I think basically more than half of these papers have authors representative here in the audience, for which I feel very lucky. And I promise I didn't cherry pick this list. In terms of the policy implication, I think one consensus in the innovation literature is that the distribution of patents or innovations value is highly skewed. So only those patents on the very right tail of the distribution have the potential to be truly impactful and useful. So in that sense, it might be a lot more important to keep the incentives of the small set of brown firms that are really good at producing green patents to continue investing in green patents instead of just increasing the pool of green patent producers. So in that sense, in order to, for the banks to play a more effective role in help us achieve the net zero targets, I think it's important for them to take greater consideration to this aspect. So thank you, that's all. I look forward to Cédric's discussion, and if any one of you have more questions after talk, feel free to email me.
Well, thank you very much, Dan, for the presentation, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me to discuss this paper. My name is Cédric. I'm from the Copenhagen Business School, and let me just quickly summarize the paper before I start the discussion. So the objective of the study is to examine how banks influence the green patenting of brown firms. So to understand the consequences of bank lending on the innovation of firm, what Zhen does in the paper is that he looks at reducing credit supply to firms with high carbon emissions, and this is referred to as brown firms. These firms are referred to as brown firms in the paper. So then Zhen uses the commitment made by banks toward carbon neutrality through a program called the Science-Based Target Initiative, SBTI. And he considers these commitments as a negative credit shock to brown firms. Okay, because the banks lower their credit supply to those brown firms, that is a shock to the credit supply. So the results that he finds in his paper for brown firm is after their banks make the commitment to carbon neutrality, is that they patent less. They patent less green patents. Yeah? So obviously there could be potentially two effects. So on the one hand, reduced supply to brown innovation could increase the incentive of brown firms to produce those green patents. But on the other hand, if the technological opportunities do not exist, then that would reduce the number of green patents, and it's the latter result that Zhen finds in his paper. Okay, and so one of the unintended consequences here is that the bank divestment from brown firms, or the reduced credit supply to brown firms, reduces high quality green innovation as measured by patent citations, among other measures. So let me list some of the strengths of the paper. Sorry, I have to look at the slides. I can't really read what's written up there. So the paper addresses obviously an important and timely topic of how bank divestment affect green innovation, or how credit supply affect green innovation. So there's a lot of literature that Zhen talked about in his presentation that looks at credit supply and innovation in general. Here there is a particular focus on green innovation. The paper uses a novel identification strategy based on the bank's staggered commitment to the SBTI program, and then makes a lot of robustness checks to kind of assess the validity of this identification strategy. It looks quite convincing as far as I'm concerned, but obviously this is never enough. So I have a couple of comments on. I will have a couple of comments on that identification strategy. The paper constructs a rich data set of green innovations by US public firms, using the traditional measure, the patent classifications, but also text measures. And the paper provides evidence for various channels and mechanisms behind the main results, such as financial constraints, credit relocation, inventory mobility, patent value, originality, generality. Okay. So I have three sets of comments, and then I have small ones that I'm going to let you read once you go back to Maryland. So I think to help interpret the result, it would be helpful to understand, so in an ideal world, to model the banking sector. And what do I mean by this? So one of the model that Zhen uses in his paper is a model by Tyrrell, where he looks at the increase in environmental friendliness, or increased greenness, if you want. So this is measured by this variable G here. So that's the increase in the sustainability of the firm, if you want. And on the other hand, you have and on the other side, so on the right-hand side here are the costs associated with that increased environmental friendliness. But what is the role of the banks here? So the banks here, they only appear through that parameter alpha here. And basically what this says is that banks have some kind of a taste for sustainability. So, without going into modeling the banking sector and how this alpha appears here, I think it would be useful to inform the empirical analysis that we understand why banks act in the way that you show they do. So, what choices do they make? What trade-offs are they facing? Why would the banks commit to the green investments? So the identification of the model relies on the commitment to this SBTI program to be exogenous. So as I already said in the introduction, Zhen does has a lot of robustness checks to try to assess the extent of the exogeneity of those commitments. However, it's a little, conceptually it's a little bit difficult to evaluate. Why? Because, well, those commitments are the result of a series of endogenous choices. So first, the banks choose, to commit to those, so first there is the endogenous matching between the firms and the banks, and the banks choose, to commit to those standards or not. And finally, the firms decide to stay with those banks or not, which I'm also going to have to talk about in a minute. So would it be possible that the banks seize their commitment with the committed banks? Well, in principle, it should be, right? So the way Zhen gets around this is by saying, well, if you had a relationship with a bank at the time that the bank made that commitment, then you're in the treated group, right? However, should that be the case necessarily? Well, not really, right? Because, as I said, banks could switch to a different financier. So not necessarily to another bank, but also to different sources of financing. Most of the banks, and I noticed, most of the banks who committed to those SBTI environmental friendliness standards seem to be foreign banks, unless I'm wrong. So foreign in the sense of non-US banks. And so the question here is how important those banks are in the overall portfolio of potential financing that the US firms receive. So if the banks are, have a marginal role, then it wouldn't be that important. On the other hand, how important are those US firms for the banks as well, for those foreign banks? If the US firms are a small share of the overall bank's worldwide revenue, then again, the effect shouldn't be that large. Finally, the last set of comments is, so there's two dimensions of sustainability in the paper. One of those dimensions is green versus non-green patents. And the other dimension is brown versus non-brown firms. So there's a dimension of technological change, as we saw in the previous paper, in the previous presentation as well. And there is a dimension about the technology of the firm itself. So the firm can be polluting or not, or the firm can create, new processes or new products. So in the paper, they're more or less treated as being conflated, but they don't have to be. So, green patents could be, as we saw in the previous paper, new products, or they could be a new process that changes the technology of the firm, that makes the firm more efficient, or if you want, closer to the green technological frontier. So the question here is, what would the interplay be between those two? So how do new technologies interact with the technology of the firm and investment in capital? So one way, I guess, to look at this would be instead of taking the green patents as your measure of success, would be to take CO2 emissions as a measure of success. I also have a couple of other small comments. As I said, I'm going to leave them for you to read a little bit later. I think one of the comment, so I put it as looking at the results between incumbents and entrants. So that relates a little bit to the results of the previous paper, about the replacement effect. So are the incumbents more likely to replace their own flow of profits compared to entrants? And the last one here is that in some of the regression results that you showed, there is a negative relationship between R&D and patents, which strikes me as being a little bit odd. So yeah, I guess you should look into those results or why this happens. I think one reason might be that some of those firms have very few green patents. I'm not really sure, why that correlation is negative. But yeah, I think that's it for me.